Time really flies, don't you think? I cannot believe we've just heard the story of the transfiguration of Jesus. Again, I guess another year has passed us by. On the plus side, that means we do get pancakes on Wednesday at A&W at 5:30, which clearly I can't stop talking about. And perhaps more importantly, the Ash Wednesday service at 7. And you have to forgive me a little bit this week because this week Mary Ellen and I were pulling together the annual report. So my mind has started to drift towards our annual meeting coming up on March 1st. And I mention this because the story of the transfiguration of Jesus always reminds me of congregational meetings. In fact, this sermon might fit better on March 1st, but you've all been given the report anyway, and I'm going to encourage people to think about it ahead of time. So, what is the connection between the story of the transfiguration of Jesus and congregational meetings? Any ideas? If anyone knows, yeah, I can sit down and you can take over. Here's one possible connection. When Jesus was up the mountain, presumably the rest of the disciples were having a nap, and perhaps you expect to sleep through the congregational meeting. But I'm actually hoping we're thinking of something else here entirely, because there's a much deeper story between a much deeper connection between the story of the transfiguration and congregational meetings. But it just occurred to me right now, you and I might be thinking of different versions of the transfiguration story. So, what other versions of the story are there? And this is not a trick question, I promise. I'm not trying to test your biblical knowledge because I'm going to give you the answer anyway. But there are four versions of the story of the transfiguration of Jesus found in the Bible. They occur in the Gospels of Matthew, we just read, Mark, Luke, and there's a reference to the event in the second epistle of Peter. So in total, there are four written versions of this story. But basically, those all match really quite well. They are the same story with slightly different words and a slightly different emphasis. So what is this other transfiguration story that I'm talking about? What other transfiguration stories do you know about? This is also not a trick question. But I want to lead into that by telling the story of the transfiguration in my own words. And since you know me, you know that when I read the Bible, I choose to read using a lens that leads to healing, hope, new life. Because that is how I understand the term good news. And gospel means good news. So, here goes. Jesus dealt with a lot of people, but he had a small group of friends we call the disciples. And within that small group, Jesus had a few really close friends, his besties, his best friends. One day, Jesus had finished teaching to a group and he wanted to spend some time away from the crowds. Jesus did this often, actually. Sometimes Jesus went into quiet space alone. Sometimes he went with his disciples. Sometimes he went just with his besties. On this occasion, Jesus went away with his besties up a hillside. Jesus wanted to find some peace, to meditate and reflect on life. Or maybe he just wanted to chill. And this was common. Jesus lived an authentic life, and making time for reflection and inner peace was important to him. Jesus made time for self-care. When Jesus and his besties went up the hillside, Jesus did indeed find inner peace. He found himself. He had that face on him I often see on people in our drum circle. Jesus felt connected. He felt loved. He was at peace. He was fully in the present moment. Jesus began to glow. If you've never seen a person glow, come to the drum circle. Anyway, Jesus' besties noticed that glow, but they didn't really know how to describe it. So they borrowed language from their own culture and used a reference to the mythical story of Moses on the mountain. That part was only in their imagination. The glow itself was real. Jesus' besties also felt this glow. They felt its presence. They felt connected. But probably in a different way than Jesus felt it, because we all respond differently to the glow. The besties' response to this glow was to try to immortalize the experience, to preserve it, to bottle it, to lay it down on tape because solid-state drives had not yet been invented. And the besties suggested this to Jesus. They suggested to Jesus should himself want to live in that place, in that glow, on the hillside, away from all the people, away from all the cares and chaos of the world. The besties preferred the glow on the hillside to the messiness of dealing with real people and their lives. And we can probably all sympathize with that feeling. And how did Jesus respond to this suggestion that he could stay isolated and live in the glow? Well, Jesus did not respond verbally to the idea. Jesus did not verbally disagree with his besties. Jesus did not belittle his besties for having the idea. No, Jesus' response was simply to walk back down the hillside to where the rest of the disciples were waiting. And because the disciples had remained together, there were other people there as well, waiting for Jesus. And the very first thing Jesus did when he returned was to help a person find healing. Turns out the disciples had tried to help the person themselves, but they had not succeeded. And Jesus loved his disciples so much that he spoke truth to them. And the truth was they lacked the faith that they could make a difference in another person's life. That's the end of my version of the transfiguration. And I've told that story many times to many different people in different ways, in different contexts. But to me, today, the story of the Transfiguration parallels the story of Chapel in the Park United Church, and more generally, the story of the United Church of Canada, and even more generally, the story of mainline Protestant churches in Canada. And the parallels for me are found in the tensions within the story. The disciples want to immortalize a perfect moment from their past, but Jesus cares more about healing and relationships. And to me, this matches the tension we see in churches today. That tension can be unveiled in different ways. One way is simply asking, why are we as a church here at all? Here are some answers I've heard from people in the past, and I'd love to hear your answers over coffee. Are we just immortalizing something from our past? Perhaps a time when we as a church had actual clout. Are we immortalizing something from our past? Perhaps a time when we worshiped together with our own children. Are we here out of habit? Are we here because our mothers made us go to church? And if that's your story, I love your mother. Are we here because this is the only place we feel we have some control in our lives? Are we here because for 1 hour a week we can pretend we still live in the past? Alternatively, are we here because we have the faith we can make a difference in another person's life? Are we here because we believe we can help people find healing and hope? Are we here because our community needs us? Are we here because we believe we can find our own healing and hope here as well? Another way to reveal this tension is to ask, what are we becoming and who are we becoming? I invite us all to think back a year. And maybe you can do this in your own time too, but think back to the last year and compare. Have we changed in the past year? Have you changed in the past year? And this is a great question for us as individuals as well as a congregation. In what ways have we changed? Who have we become in the past year? There's a great song by the rock band Styx called "Man in the Wilderness." It simply asks, or doesn't ask, says, "Another year has passed me by. Still, I look at myself and cry, what kind of man have I become?" The singer was male, by the way. But we should ask ourselves, what kind of person have we become? And what kind of person do we want to be? We can also ask, what kind of church have we become and what kind of church do we want to be? Another way to unveil this tension is to see the church as a ship. As William Shedd famously said, a ship in a harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. It's a good analogy to the church today. Again, not just Chapel in the Park, but most mainline Protestant churches. Because you can, if you have a ship, you can keep it in the harbor and keep it maintained. The hull will be clean, the decks will be spotless, the sails will be perfect. It will be the perfect ship, except for the little detail that if the ship stays in the harbor, it's not really living out its identity as a ship. Or you can take a ship out to sea. If you need repairs undersea, they're probably either difficult or impossible. The hull will become contaminated, the decks will become greasy, the sails will rip in strong winds. But a ship at sea is living out its identity of being a ship. So, do we have an image of church as a place that's perfect because we never venture out and try new things? Or do we engage in our own community and have honest relationships with each other, even if that exposes us to the messiness of our world? Or, God forbid, the messiness of our own lives? We need to ask ourselves, what kind of church have we become? What kind of church do we want to be? And that's something we can all think about for 2 weeks. I'm sure you're really glad I brought this up now. And I don't want to just leave the story there, because I think I've taken a pretty good angle on Jesus' contribution to the transfiguration. But what about the disciples and their role? Plus, I realized I often in chit chat to say how the transfiguration is like the movie Star Wars, and we haven't got there yet. But I think the actions of the disciples and the besties were very, very typical. I think they acted the way we would have acted if we'd been there ourselves. Their behavior is so common, it's actually one of the principal themes in the 1977 movie Star Wars. If you remember the movie, Luke travels to Dagobah to meet a Jedi Master, Yoda. And Yoda teaches Luke to do many things, including levitating objects. After Luke successfully learns to levitate small rocks, Yoda challenges Luke to lift his spacecraft, which is stuck in the mud. It's a single-seater job, it's not that big. And Luke attempts to lift the spaceship, but with defeat fully planted in his mind before he even started. And he fails. And Luke tells Yoda that levitating a rock and a spaceship are completely different things. And Yoda says, no difference, only different in your mind. And then Yoda, who's only about this big himself, levitates the spacecraft and puts it on the shore. Where the spaceship, he got it out of the mud that it had been buried in for a couple of weeks, probably. And when Luke sees the spaceship safely on the shore, Luke says, I can't believe it. And Yoda says to Luke, that is why you failed. I should get Luke to teach me. It's probably more like, that is why you failed. But Luke failed because he could not believe that what he was attempting was even possible. Exactly like the disciples who failed to heal a person because they could not believe it was possible. The idea that we cannot succeed is very strong, but we collectively can do meaningful things together. The story of the transfiguration of Jesus in many ways parallels the story of this and other congregations. With the very real difference, we don't know how the story ends. We get to decide that for ourselves. And I want to be just a little nicer to you guys today, because it's sometimes a pain when a minister talks about change, right? It always feels like, we have to do more or we have to whatever. It always sounds like a lot of work when you say the word change. I get that. But change also means doing less of things from our past that we don't need to do anymore, and doing more of the things that bring us life and joy today. In fact, I wasn't going to talk about this because it hasn't been fully resolved, but there was a really interesting thing at UCW this week, because there was some discussion, do we have to actually provide a complete 3-course meal for UCW, or can we scale back to something a little more like cookies? And this story has not finished playing out yet. But what I was hearing was we have this memory that we had all this food, and it's like, do we need this? So change can mean less. Doesn't always mean you have to do more. I open by saying that there are different versions of a transfiguration story. But the most important version of the transfiguration story for me personally today is just the story of this congregation. Because we need to ask ourselves, what kind of church have we become? What kind of church do we want to be? And we'll finish this sermon in 2 weeks. Amen.